Hello and welcome everyone to another Artist Loft 101 drawing class. I'm Adrienne Hodge, your instructor. And yeah, as Nate said, this is part 2 in a 4-part series called Mixed Media Perspective Drawing. So we will be completing a mixed media perspective drawing. So if you missed part 1, you might want to and you still want to watch tonight's class, then you can just take notes on where we are and then go back and watch the first class on sketching a layout for perspective drawing. And I may reference the other 2 linear perspective classes that I had before this mini series, and that was Intro to Perspective Drawing, which was actually linked in the supply list for tonight's class as a prerequisite. And I see that Nate just dropped it in the chat there. But if you're watching this recording later, you can find that on YouTube just by searching Artist Loft 101 and Intro to Perspective Drawing, and that should come right up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my tabletop view and review the supplies for tonight. But before I do that, if you want to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michael's or Michael's classes this evening. And if you want to ensure that I see your work, you can follow me on Instagram or tag me in your post of your artwork so I am sure to see it. Also, right after the class tonight at 7:05 p.m. CST, Central Time, I'm going to be hopping on Instagram Live right after the class. And so if anybody wants to join me over there on, so you just go to @Adrienne Hodge Art on Instagram, and you should see like my profile picture will be flashing that I'm live. And then I will continue the discussion because I'm just very aware of the fact that at the end of the class, there's a lot of folks who tend to have lingering questions or maybe would just like to hang out and talk with me. And whenever I teach in-person classes, I'm always the kind of teacher that hangs around in the hallway after class and, just chit chats with people. And so that's what's missing from this online experience. And so I thought I'd recreate that by just doing a little live session afterwards. So it's just 30 minutes. I'll be on Instagram, and then it will actually stay up on my Instagram indefinitely. If you just go to the IGTV, it automatically will share there. Okay, so the supplies, just to review, we're not going to be using all of these supplies tonight. We're going to be mainly using the illustration pens tonight. So I've got those front and center. Oh, and then let me get rid of my business cards. It's my little more shameless self-promotion here. If you want to follow me on Facebook, if you don't have Instagram, I'm Adrienne Hodge Fine Art on, oh, my light is glaring there. Well, hopefully you can see it. Adrienne Hodge Fine Art on Facebook, and then there's my email. Pretty easy to find online, and there's some of my personal work that I do with mainly calligraphy inks. And yeah, okay, so the sketching pencils were what we used last week. Although if you only used 1 or 2 of those, you are not alone. I think I probably stuck to 1 pencil for most of the layout last week, but it's good to have that variety on hand. This week we're using the illustration pens, and then next week, just grab a few of these, so I need to grab them all. We'll be using the lovely Artist Loft watercolor pencils. And so you will also need some paintbrushes. I've got the Artist Loft paintbrushes here to use with the watercolor pencils next week. And then you'll also need a water cup, paper towel, all the things that you would need if you were painting, but we're going to be working with the watercolor pencils, but also, but using some painting, some drawing and painting techniques. So yeah, that will be next week. We'll create a palette that is based on the reference photo for tonight or for this entire series. And then in the final 4th part of this series in 2 weeks from tonight, we'll just be completing the mixed media perspective drawing. So you might have something that looks like this, a product that looks like this by the end of the class, but hopefully yours will look a little bit different because we're not robots. Nobody's going to be, you know, copying mine completely. And if you would like to use, or I mean, we're going to be following along step by step and doing the same things, but I'm just saying, don't, you know, feel free to explore your creative whims and make yours a little bit different than mine if you'd like. And if you'd like to use your own reference photo, you are more than welcome to, but this was the reference photo that was linked in the supply list as well. And I know a lot of folks were just following along with me and using the same reference photo last week. You'll also need the 6x9 watercolor paper and some blue tape to tape that down, a ruler, although we're pretty much done with the ruler. We will use the ruler a little bit tonight, but not much. You could also get by with a straight edge. It doesn't have to be a ruler. And then synthetic eraser, although for what we're doing tonight, the eraser will be no help to you, but for last week we had the eraser. So those were all the supplies for the entire 4-part series, but tonight we're going to be using the illustration pens. So I've got 3 illustration pens here, the 0.1, the 0.3, and the 0.5. So I'm going to get this other stuff out of the way and just review what we did last week and explain why I have this red string here. So last week we used the reference photo and our ruler and the sketching pencils to create a layout. And so what we were looking for by the end of class was something that looks like this, that's sort of empty and doesn't have any value on it. So the reason why I didn't want you to add value was because we're going to be adding it with our pens. I know a lot of people were anxious last week to get started adding the shading, particularly those who joined me afterwards in the Instagram live were saying that they had a hard time leaving it empty like this and they really wanted to add the detail. So tonight we're going to be adding all those details, but we're going to be doing it with the pen and ink, but also keeping in mind what we're going to be adding to it with the watercolor pencils so we can leave space for the watercolor pencils. So we will be using some shading techniques tonight, and I forgot before the class started to ask Nate to link the classes on value shading techniques, but those are easy to find on YouTube. We had several classes on value shading in the early days of these Artist Loft Drawing 101 class way back in July and August. We talked about tonal shading. We talked about hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. You do not need to have knowledge of those shading techniques for tonight because I'm going to do a quick little tutorial on them. But if you wanted to bookmark it and go back and find those classes on YouTube on value shading techniques, you can just search value and Artist Loft 101 and you should be able to find those. Like I said, there was one on tonal shading and then hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. When we apply value, what we want to always do is keep in mind the contours of the form. So those of you who've been joining every class since July are like, gosh, how many more times is she going to say this? It's almost as if, I mean, in my opinion, 99% of drawing is understanding 3-dimensional forms and noticing those value shapes because everything boils down to the light, people. I mean, if we were in a pitch black dark room right now, you wouldn't see me, right? Or you wouldn't see my paper. And if I were to light a match, all you would see is whatever the match was illuminating. So everything that we see is based on the light that is falling across it. So those shapes of shadows and shapes of light are just so imperative to rendering realistic forms when we draw. Okay, so I think that's all the review. I'm just going to get into it here. So the reason I have the string is so I can really see all these contours and the contours on the forms. This time it's not an apple, it's a house. It's a house and a fence and a picnic table. And there are some organic forms in this photograph because we have the trees are organic. We've got the grass is organic. So we've got a little bit of a landscape with those things in mind. And then we've got the lights. So we need to render all of those based on the light that is falling against them. So we're going to use more lines, more geometric, straight lines, parallel lines, and well, orthogonal lines in the case of the 2-point perspective house. But when it comes to certain things, we maybe will use more parallel lines. Okay, I'm getting away from myself, but my point is this string is going to help us see the contours. In the very first class, I also used a string and I wrapped it around that apple, and I talked about how the apple was round, and I note how the string is wrapping around it. And so we need to create a form that is rounded. Well, it's the same thing with this house, only we've got all of these orthogonal lines. So as we go to add our value onto these orthogonal lines, we're gonna, the value, the shading, the lines that we put on the side of the house are gonna follow the orthogonal lines in the perspective. And if all of that is confusing you, then that's when you want to go back and watch those classes on Intro to Linear Perspective. So what I've done here to help illustrate that, and just to review from last week, is I've put, my desk happens to be magnetic, and so I've put a magnet on top of the string right where my vanishing point is. I'll just point my camera at it so that you can see that. So I've got the magnet right there on top of the string where the vanishing point is. And so that allows me to use the string to double check myself and see if all of my orthogonal lines are matching. As I did notice last week at the end of the class, oh, I just misplaced my magnet a little bit, when a lot of folks were holding up their layouts, that we had some, and I'm going to use a word I try not to ever use in an art class when giving feedback, but we had some wrong lines, you guys. They were wrong, and I hate to use the word wrong, but when it comes to linear perspective, there is the way that our eyes perceive geometric forms in space, and there is the way that our eyes imagine we see lines in three-dimensional space. And so if you recall in the Intro to Linear Perspective class, we talked about what was wrong with this painting from the pre-Renaissance era, and then what is right. So it's wrong just because that's not how our eyes perceive three-dimensional space. It doesn't mean that there's anything bad with your drawing if your lines are not lining up with the orthogonal lines, but it's an easy fix. And so you can take your straight edge and line it up with the vanishing points. And also last week I had a nice little flub that somebody was kind enough to point out, and that was that in my original example here, I had just made this second house here facing me because I was having issues seeing the linear perspective on this house. But then after somebody pointed it out when I was doing the layout, I realized these windows actually were in 1-point perspective here, and they did line up with the vanishing point. And so in this drawing, I made sure to line them up with my vanishing point. Do they look a little bit askew to me now? Yes, they do, because I didn't draw this image perfectly exactly like I see it as far as the spacing of the houses. And I kind of just dove in with it last week and made sure that my horizon line was matched up, and things were thereabouts in the right places, because we're not looking for a highly accurate Frank Lloyd Wright architectural drawing here. We just want something that is close enough to what our eyes see. So having used the word wrong and hopefully not upset anybody, if yours is, you know, is way off, you might want to fix it. But if it's close enough, then I would just leave it there. Like when I got this string out to double check myself, I noticed. So yes, most of them are lining up with my vanishing point here on this side. Let me take my magnet and do it on the other side and check those. And by the way, I did not invent this idea to use the string. I kept seeing this online this week, and I would love to credit the artist who came up with this idea. But if anybody knows, I've seen it in a few places online recently using a string to do linear perspective, and I thought that would be great to use tonight. So everything on this side of the corner does appear to be lining up pretty well with my second vanishing point. So if I was trying to get these windows to line up, they're not going to, because they are their orthogonal lines are traveling to vanishing point 1. And then everything on this side, or not everything, but most of the orthogonal lines on this side of the corner of the house are traveling towards vanishing point 2. One thing that I did notice that I was off about here is the table, the picnic table. So I'm going to fix that on my end real quick here. So the back of the table is lined up with my vanishing point, and that front end of the table is lined up. But this little side, because the table is on a corner, is not lined up with my vanishing point on the right side. So I'm just doing a quick little double check before I add any pen to this. And if you're taking your, well, that's going to make this really highly skewed, but that's what we want. So I'm going to kind of just, it's a very skewed rhombus here. That looks a little better. So like I said, if yours is really off, you might just stick to your sketchbook tonight, or take notes and go back and rewatch the first video to get everything lined up. Like if you're taking your straight edge and you're lining it up to your vanishing point and a lot of your orthogonal lines are not matching up, then you might want to fix it. Okay, moving on. So let's grab an extra sheet of our watercolor paper. And I'm just going to use my same example here. We're going to do a quick little test of all of the illustration pens before we start adding our value with the pens. And if you want to stick to your sketchbook and not do this on your final paper tonight, you're welcome to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and dive in and do it on my final paper. Because the one thing about pen is there are no take backs. So once you put a line on in pen, you can't erase it. But I think that's the wonderful thing about ink that I love so much. Okay, so I'm going to start with the 0.1, and I'm just going to make a series of let me get an extra piece of paper here. The reason I wanted to use the watercolor paper is so that we can see how those marks are absorbing on the watercolor paper rather than in a sketchbook, because the paper matters and it is a little bit different. Just left my watercolor pad on the other side of the room. Trying not to have to go grab it, but then I did. Okay, so with the 0.1, we're just going to do a series of lines and tones here. So we did have a class a while back on lines and tones where we did this with all of our materials just to see what they can do, see how thick the lines are. So we're going to do some cross-hatching lines, some parallel horizontal lines and then some vertical lines just to see what kind of mark we can make. Then we're going to make some dots. So that would be our hatching and cross hatching, our stippling dots here, or that's our cross hatching. And then we'll make a few dots, and then we'll do some scribbling action. And then we'll do some straight horizontal parallel lines. So as we do that, we can see with the 0.1, we can get very fine lines like that. And then we'll do that with the 0.3. And as you're doing this, try to put more pressure on the pen in some moments and let up on your pressure in other moments. On the class in lines and tones, I really go in depth talking about pressure and why it matters. I've probably talked about that in more than just that class, but in that class, I really took my time speaking about how I hold my pen differently, or pencil, charcoal. It was with the entire Artist Loft 101 set, and that was called Lines and Tones, that class. So just notice how the pressure that you're putting on the pen can affect the type of mark that you're making. So the 0.3 is a little bit thicker nib, and so it can get some bolder lines with that. We'll practice all those techniques, and I realize this is a very quick run through, but the longer version of this would be looking at those classes on value shading techniques, hatching, cross hatching. So it's hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling, and we've got the full value scale for all of those. And they're all a matter of overlapping. So you either overlap your lines, your one directional lines, until you get a solid black for the darkest value on the scale, and then you let up on your pressure, space out your lines for the lighter values. And then for the lightest lights, we want to leave the paper blank. So those zeros on the value scale are very important when we're using ink, because we don't have the option of erasing. So the 0.5 pen is your thickest nib in this little set anyway. And we can get some really thick bold lines. So if we've got an area that's really dark, it's going to be easier to fill that area in with the 0.5 nib than it will be to fill in with the 0.1. And if we've got a really light area, we're probably going to be using the 0.1 nib. And the amount of pressure that we put on the pen is going to really influence how dark that mark comes across. And then the last thing that I want to say before we start actually adding some pen and ink to these layouts is, I'm referencing so many of the other classes that I didn't tell Nate to grab the links to, but they're all easy to find on YouTube. And that's Impliedline. I had an entire class on Impliedline, and that is the lines that we don't draw. And those are probably the most important lines when it comes to pen and ink drawing, because you can't erase it. Once you put it down, you can't take it back, right? So planning ahead for what you're going to leave blank paper is really important. But also, when you're drawing with the pen, there's a certain nuanced thing that occurs when we let the line kind of disappear and become more of an implied line. So I did that on a lot of the little orbs of light. I'm going to get really close to my drawing here, and you can see a lot of the lines that I put around the little light orbs are not complete circles. They're like little half circles, or 3/4 of a circle. And the way that I achieve that is really this is the technique, and I've talked about this before, but I kind of hover over the paper when I'm drawing a line. So let's all just kind of sketch a few circles here, because this will probably be the trickiest moment in our drawing, is trying to get those light orbs to be really light. So I'm using the 0.1 nib, which is the smallest nib, and I'm just hovering over the page. But I'm not just going to do this with the light orbs. I'm going to do this with a majority of my drawing. This is just my technique when I use pens. And as you guys know, I use a lot of pen and ink in my personal artwork. So I like to think I've mastered the art of drawing with a pen in a way that makes it look nice and loose and carefree, because I'm pretty comfortable with pens at this point, but I know a lot of people are not, especially beginners. So that is the whole thing, is just hovering over the page and not quite putting my pen down all the way. So kind of think about drawing the circle in the air, and then put your pen down and just let it be, you know, as loose and carefree as possible. But we're going to do that with a lot of these lines, just hovering and almost sketching. Well, not almost, we are sketching with our pens. So if you want to practice that, or even just stick to your sketchbook paper tonight until you feel more comfortable before you add it to your watercolor paper, that would be good. So let's start with the most organic part of this photograph, just to be nice and kind to ourselves tonight. So the most organic thing would be the trees. And I had a whole class on drawing trees. And one of the main kind of showstopper moment of that class was how to make a mass of leaves look or read to the audience as leaves. And when we're looking at leaves that are far away, like these, we don't want to draw every little, oh, where'd my scrap paper go again? Or my scrap watercolor paper. We don't want to draw every little oval shape or leaf shape that because we can't see that. We can't see any leaves in detail necessarily. It's more this mass of leaves. So we're going to do that more with this jagged line with some keyholes in between. That's how we're going to indicate that is a mass of leaves there. So I'm looking more at the overall shape of those leaves and sketching in just a few little keyhole moments within those. And honestly, this is the most we're going to do to the trees, because I think the watercolor is going to be what we need to fill these in. But if you wanted to go ahead and add some texture to these leaves with the pens, what I would advise doing is more filling in the mass of the leaves, not trying to draw any of the leaves again. So I would look at, like, where is the patch of leaves the darkest, and fill that in with a little series of hatching or cross hatching lines. But we can really fill that in, the color of it and the value of it, with the watercolor pencils. Mostly I'm going to concentrate my pen lines to the architecture. Are there any questions at this point, Nate? Anything jumping out at you?
No, it's all right in the chat at the moment. I think we're all just super focused and tuning in here to see, how we can progress our own drawings.
Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna get my feet wet with the pen in this drawing by just lightly overlaying some pen on top of my pencil lines that I already had there for the outline of the trees. And I can mostly leave that blank unless you wanted to fill it in with some hatching and cross hatching, since our watercolor pencils will really do the job of filling those in for us later. So in my final drawing, you can see I did add few extra little hatching, cross hatching moments, but mostly I just did the outline of the trees and then filled it in with my black and green and all the lovely colors that we'll be using to get the color of the trees. So I'm letting it be very implied, and if you can still see your pencil lines underneath the pen, you can go back in when you're done and just erase the pencil lines. That's another reason why it's so important to draw very lightly with your pencil so that you can easily erase the pencil if it's still showing through in a mixed media work like this. And that's why I didn't want us to add too much value with the pencils last week, so that we could erase them this week or next week when we get more into the drawing. But I know a lot of people were really wanting to add the value, and to them I said, you know, do what you want. I'm not the boss of you. If you want this to be a graphite drawing and, you know, don't add the pen and ink to it, then you're more than welcome to just watch tonight and let yours be graphite and watercolor. Anytime you have more than two mediums in a work of art, it's mixed media. If you've got graphite and watercolor pencils, mixed media. You've got graphite and pen, mixed media. So just fun little aside there if you want to impress your friends by calling everything mixed media. Okay, this area right here in inside of the, next to the house, behind the lights here, there is another part of this house, and there's another house in the background and a fence line. But I wanted to create some contrast where the lights are popping out. And the way that I do that is by making it nice and dark behind the lights here. And I mentioned this in part one of this this mini series last week. If I cover up that part that's highly contrasted right there, yes, the lights do still glow in the center, but they don't pop the same, because this is what's creating that optical illusion of like light really popping off the page there. So I am going to go ahead and dive into a trickier part of this, because we're already at 6:37 here, and go ahead and loosely outline those light orbs, just to give myself parameters for where I'm going to add that dark contrasting. Also, for anybody who, you know, is feeling trepidation about the lights in this image, like that's the trickiest part of it. I'm sure you're not alone, and in every class I've ever taught, you know, where somebody's working on a very involved work of art, painting or drawing, it seems like the MO or the instinct is to often avoid the trickiest part of the art and save it until the last, because it's, you know, it's tricky and it's scary and we're afraid we're going to mess it up, right? But I like to just dive in and do the hardest part first, get it out of the way, you know, and then you can kind of relax and coast through the rest of it. So, but that may just be me. I always was the type of student in school when they had like an oral presentation, or, you know, something where it's like you sign up to go first, or there's always like the students who sign up to go last. I never wanted to go last. I always wanted to get out of the way so that I could relax and just watch everybody else's presentations. So maybe that's just me, but I like to get it out of the way first. So I'm gonna go ahead and put those in, and then maybe take a little breather here and add a few more sketchy lines in a few other places. So if you want to just kind of loosely outline the darkest moments first, that's a good way to start as well. If you're kind of just taking notes and going to do this later, I would not outline everything right off the bat, but outline the moments where it gets the darkest first, because you know it's going to end up getting pretty dark on the fence. You know, it's going to end up getting pretty dark in this shadow right here. It's going to get pretty dark on the roof, and then in this area right here. So you can warm up by just using your 0.1 to lightly outline all the areas where it gets the darkest. Also, now would be a good time to go ahead and erase my extra orthogonal lines that I don't need right there. Go ahead and take those out. Oh, I'm shaking my other camera over there. And I'll go ahead and erase my lines and the tree lines as well. So when I erase those pencil lines, you can really see the effect of implied lines that I'm creating there by not doing a full, mark around all those places. Okay, so I'll admit when I was drawing this the first time, I couldn't decide if I wanted to put the house in or take it out. So I kept kind of going back and forth between putting it in and then I ended up covering it up. But this time I already know I want to cover it up. So instead of having the fence line and everything there, I'm going to go ahead and just start doing, I'm switched to my 0.5, my fattest nib. And now I'm really getting to the meat and potatoes of things here. And I'm going to start using vertical hatching lines to start making this a solid dark. And when it comes to these shading techniques in pen and ink, people always ask, what is the point in using hatching or cross hatching or stippling or scribbling to fill in an area that's going to be solid dark? Why not just like color it, just kind of like you would with a crayon, right? And to them, I say, just because, no, there is a reason. Because it has a certain quality, because it looks nicer, because the eye, even though it seems like the viewer's eye will still just read that as a dark area, the eye does pick up on those contours. So having it be a uniform contour, having the value follow the contours of the form. So in this instance, the form is just background space, but by having all of my lines follow a uniform hatching mark here, it's creating this mass in the viewer's perception of it so that all of this gets lumped together and it gets read as a mass. Like if it were a mass of water, I would use horizontal lines, and I could use horizontal lines here, but the vertical lines make me think of like a fence, and so it kind of just gets read, I think, as a fence or whatever. But I think vertical lines make the most sense here. You could fill it in with horizontal lines as well, but you want those to be uniform and overlapping until we get to a solid dark. So we're looking for like a 9 or a 10 on our value scale here. So as solid as we can get, overlapping those lines, and I'm kind of going right up against the light orbs and then stopping and leaving just a little bit of space around those. And I'll probably switch to my smaller nib before I fill those in. And I might leave a little bit more light around those in my hatching lines. So, and I have a couple of kids. I got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and when I'm coloring with them, I have taught, well, my 8-year-old has picked up a lot of my techniques, but do like your kind of loose coloring or filling in. When you're filling in an area, go right up to the edge, kind of like if you were doing a bubble cut with scissors, you would do you would slow down to do your precision cutting. But, you know, while you're being kind of fast and loose with it, it's good to just give yourself a little bit of space from that area where you want to have a more precise line. That way you don't accidentally go into that light orb while you're being fast and loose. So I see my 8-year-old coloring that way, and it makes me so proud. Not that, you know, coloring outside of the lines is good too, but I like when I see her using that technique. Okay, so I can come back to that and fill that in the rest of the way, but that's pretty good. Go back, well here, let me use the 0.3. I haven't used the 0.3 very much yet. So now I'm gonna start putting in some of those hatching lines on the side of the house. So I could pull my string back out if I wanted to here to see exactly how I'm gonna do that, but I just know that I need to make sure that my hatching lines are following the orthogonal angle here. So if I took out my string and my magnet again, every hatching line that I make on the side of this house needs to follow the rules of linear perspective. If I were to make these lines straight on the side of the house, then it wouldn't be read as 1 point or 2 point perspective anymore. So all of those hatching lines need to follow below the horizon line. They need to start angling down, etc. So just like when we drew our cubes in the intro to linear perspective class. Here, let me pull out that example real quick. Oh, well, yeah, here's my 2 point perspective. So all of the orthogonal lines that we added, that hatching and cross hatching, they follow the same path as those more prominent lines like the windows or the side of the house. And if there's one that's a little off, it's not the end of the world. You can go back over it and make it a little more. I think I realized I just kind of did a little bit there. Okay, I'm going to put a little siding on the side of the house here with a vertical line, being careful not to go into my light orbs. And then I'm just going to bounce around and add some details to the trim on the windows. So inside of the windows, I kind of used diagonal lines to just fill those in, to maybe read those a little bit separately. Or you could do some scribbling inside of those, or some cross hatching, whatever you want. But if you wanted to break it up a little bit and use scribbling or stippling, that would be good. Let's see. Go ahead and fill in all of the windows with a little bit of diagonal lines here, because I just think that looks nice. And it kind of separates the windows from the rest of the house. And I'm going to erase these orthogonal lines that I don't need here anymore. Okay, so remember the triangle shape of the roof of the house isn't linear perspective. It just actually is a triangle. So that's why that line doesn't follow the linear perspective here. Although this little line, this lip, does need to go to my second vanishing point here. Just pull out my string, put that in like that. That little bit of a detail can make all the difference. If a little mark like that is off, it could bug you. You're looking at it and you're like, what is off about it? And it could be just one little nuanced thing like that. And if there's a couple of nuanced things like that that are off, who really cares? Last week, I think it was about this point in the class where there was like 10 minutes left, and it's like, okay, if at the end of this drawing you are satisfied mostly and you feel like it's a nice drawing, but it's not perfectly rendered in linear perspective and not all of the angles are following linear perspective, ask yourself who is that voice that's telling you that there's something wrong with it, you know? Because I had some things that were a little wonky about my final drawing here, and I'm cool with it. It's not, you know, if the voice is just me, it's my voice that's criticizing me, well, I can just change that very easily by being kinder to myself. And if it's the voice of somebody else, then it's time to cut that person out of your life. Just kidding, but maybe it is. Okay. But yeah, I'm gonna stop talking for just a minute and just fill in a lot of these areas in the same way. So when I'm doing the hatching lines on this corner of the house, on this side of the corner, I need to make sure all of those hatching lines are following the orthogonal path, traveling to that vanishing point, and I'm just diving in with that. Here's where they would be straight. Above that, they start to angle up. Oh my goodness, I just drew right over the fence. There's a fence right here. Oh my gosh. And that was where I put all this lovely. Okay, well, here's a good moment to just talk about when you make a quote unquote mistake in pen, like I just did. I just filled in that whole area that I wanted to be the fence. I totally forgot about this line as the fence. So when you make a mark on your page that you didn't mean to be there, like I just got real excited putting those hatching lines in, and I totally forgot that I wanted to put this fence right here. And I wanted to illustrate that using vertical lines that were sort of implied. And I really liked the loose way that I rendered that fence in this other example. So, but I've done it now. I can't take it back. So here's what you do. This is my two-part process to when you make a mistake. First, you take a deep breath and you accept that you made what you consider to be a mistake or a wrong mark in pen that you can't take away. Then you might take a break from that area and just work on something else for a minute, and, you know, try not to be too hard on yourself about the fact that you made a mark that you can't take away. I would never advise ripping this up and throwing it in the trash and saying I'm starting over and it's ruined, although I've seen plenty of people do that in my many years of teaching all ages. Don't do that for several reasons, because, you know, there might be parts of this drawing that you prefer that you might want to look at. If you do decide to start over, if you think a mistake is so bad that you have to start over, then you know, keep this one, don't throw it in the trash. But I would, most of the time whenever I've like started over on something because I felt like a mistake couldn't be fixed and I start over, 9 times out of 10 I end up going back to the first one where I made the, you know, what I thought was a mistake, because, you know, oftentimes there's just qualities that you like about that first attempt. But yeah, so now that I've calmed down a little bit and I've accepted that I made that mistake, now I'm just gonna put in the details on the fence that I wanted to originally draw, and I'm just gonna have to accept that I put those horizontal hatching lines in there. Try to make it look like I meant to do that. So on this fence, it's kind of hard to see and it's a lot wider in the photograph, but there's the little metal clasps, whatever you want to call them. So I put those in because I thought that made it interesting. And then it's a little wonky. The fence isn't perfectly vertical in a lot of areas, so I tried to make that come across in the way I rendered those, and I made it very implied, and it was one of my favorite parts of the other drawing, and now it's ruined. Just kidding, it's not ruined, but it's got some lines I didn't want to be there. Okay, I think that's still pretty good. When I go to add the color, that'll come across nicely as the fence. Okay, what have I not worked on yet? This fence in front. So I'm just following the contours of the form here, which is, I'm going to need a lot of vertical lines. And then my horizontal lines just need to follow the orthogonal path that the fence does to those vanishing points. And I think it's fun to do some cross hatching on here because I can, use straight vertical lines all the way down this fence line and then go back over it with the orthogonal hatching. All right, how are we doing on time? I'm running out of it, so I'm gonna zip it along here. The last thing I haven't touched on is the big shadow here. So it's darkest right here. I'm just gonna loosely fill it in with my 0.5 pen, my heaviest pen, but I'm doing that loose scratchy thing with it. This can also be added with the watercolor pencils if you're feeling cautious about it. I'm just gonna let it kind of disappear because I recall I didn't put it in super heavy and I think I actually used scribbling on it. So I would advise leaving the pen and ink drawing sort of like this, like try not to overdo it too much with the pen because you can always add the pen in later with once we've started adding the watercolor pencils. You can let a layer dry and then go back in with your pen. So I think it's better to, if you're having, like a thought that you want to add more pen in one area, but you're not sure, maybe just let it sit and wait and see. You can always add it later once we started adding the watercolor pencil layers. It's like cutting your bangs. You can always trim a little bit more, but you can never put them back. You just have to wait for them to grow back. So with the pen, the analogy is you can always add more pen, but you can't take it away. So it's better to leave it kind of loose and empty if you're unsure of certain details and go back and add those later. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left and I'd love to see how everybody else has done with their drawings so far. So I'd love to see some examples. And if you have any questions, I know we don't really have time to answer any questions, but you can join me on Instagram just right after class. 5 minutes after class ends, I'll be on Instagram live answering any leftover questions, or if you just want to chit chat and talk more about your drawings, that's where I'll be. So Nate, do we have any folks holding up their examples? Oh, look at that. I thought that was mine for a second. That looks so great. I was like, wait a second, I don't have yellow masking tape. Very nice. Very nice. And yeah, leaving some blank area around those lights because we can always add the pen back in. The tree line is really lovely there too. Oh, nice. Already getting some color in there. Cool, cool. Right. Yeah, and if you didn't tape things down with the blue tape around the edges, it's not too late to do that now before we add the watercolor pencil. Oh, I love the tree line. I like that you're taking your time and adding your pen slowly. Very nice. Okay. Oh, look at that one. That one really jumps off the page. I like that you turned it horizontal. Got more width there on those houses. Oh, and that person put the other house in the background in. Really good depth coming across there. Oh, my closed captioning is over that one. I should have made those go away. That's very nice. All right, these are great examples, y'all. Thank you for sharing. And if we didn't get to your example and you want to share those on social media and tag me at Adrian Hodge Art so that I can be sure to see them. I'd love to see them, or you can email them to me, whatever you want to do. And yeah, if you have any questions, join me on the Instagram live. And if you are watching the recording of this later, the Instagram live with the Q&A will be on my Instagram for you to view tomorrow or right after it ends. All right, thank you guys so much for another great class, and we'll see you next week for starting to add the watercolor pencils. We'll create a palette for that before we do that.